Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is Kid Nate of BloodyElbow.com, joined for a special treat, a special edition of the MMA Tete-A-Tete, the MMA third quarter business review for 2014, joined by Brian D'Souza and Jack Encarnacio. Brian, the author of, what's your book?
Pound for Pound, The Modern Gladiators of Mixed Martial Arts.
Awesome. It is the best book ever written about the MMA business, I believe. There's plenty of histories of the sport, but this is the best inside look at the business. And Jack Encarnacio, host of Dogs Rewind, for my dollar, the best MMA podcast going. So,
hey now, I wish it would go a little more these days. I'm going to get back on the horse. I know people have been kind of thirsting for more. It's been a lot going on, but we'll get back there.
You leave them hungry, and they find somebody else, Jack.
Well, either that or they want it, harder.
We'll just let that go. So yesterday, did everybody enjoy the Mayhem Miller standoff in L.A.? The SWAT team live tweeting. It had it all. It was good. News helicopters, social media, just big coverage in the Daily Beast today. What's wrong with MMA fighters? Like, does that sum up the state of the industry this quarter, or what? Who wants to talk about this first? We had War Machine, the biggest story of August. The biggest story of this quarter in MMA was War Machine and Christy Mack. That is not good for business.
Well, it's not good for business, but it's also the way it works. And if you have athletes in your sport who do this, that's going to grab the attention of the media faster than any positive thing they do. And that's just the punches that the industry has to roll with. You just have to hope that said fighter isn't under your employ at the time he does, anti-social, sociopathic things. And I'm not so sure if the business creates these people. I think it's much more likely that sociopaths are attracted to this business in the first place. Not as a general rule. Not all fighters have issues. Not all fighters are just, one straw away from having the camel's back broken. But there are enough of them, perhaps an overrepresentative sample in the business, and they happen to be, very colorful, good with words, social media aware, and all of that fuels what becomes sort of like a mini media frenzy, at least in case of War Machine and Jason Miller.
I see. And Brian, do you agree with that? I mean, is that what we're seeing? Is an overrepresentation of sociopaths in MMA? Because I don't know, if you looked at volunteer firefighters or accountants or baseball players, like lots of domestic violence in all those fields.
Mayhem's not a sociopath.
That we
or at
know.
least he's mentally ill. Like he has, maybe he's
Allegedly.
schizophrenic or he's bipolar. He could be personality disordered. The reason he probably fell into MMA is, again, we were talking last time we talked, the codependent tendencies. People who are addicts, people who are missing something in their lives, they're gonna, seep on MMA. It expresses himself differently sometimes with Chris Lieben, who's just a drug addict. But he's done some fucked up things, as he admitted. He talked about some really crazy shit he did before his fights, getting wasted, nearly getting arrested and stuff like that. Mayhem has sociopathic tendencies. He's definitely antisocial. But he would have started out doing more serious crimes or done them throughout his life if he was a lot more criminal-minded. He's like Amanda Bynes, she has a DUI. Nick Diaz has a couple DUIs. That's a result of probably some, childhood abuse and then addiction and other problems. And these guys won't ever talk about this stuff. It breaks my heart that they're going to be labeled as criminals or savages. It
really breaks your heart for War Machine to be labeled a savage?
No, not really. But in other guys' cases, this tarring of all the MMA fighters with the same brush isn't what should be happening. And Miller, he's had a lot of incidents. We had this story from Mike Afromowitz that he punched out someone in Strikeforce, an employee.
The guy was fired afterwards, though. The consensus at the time, as I recall, was that the staffer of Strikeforce was out of line. And I don't know. I mean, there's obviously a tendency to protect your star over the staff, but at the time, Mayhem wasn't blamed for the incident.
And then, of course, he nearly got into Bellator, but he blew that. And then in his last UFC fight, after UFC 146, he wanted a beer or something, and UFC staffer wouldn't give it to him, and then he got fired for just a poor attitude. And that's nothing on that. UFC did the right thing in that case. I think we should give them some props. You can't keep someone like that around, keep validating their shit attitude. With stars, that always happens. Their shit attitude always gets validated. because they're worth money, right?
It's true. It's true. But like that's what we've had a paucity of. Going to segue here. This quarter, we were framed by what were supposed to be two mega events. UFC 175 was supposed to have Ronda Rousey, Chris Weidman, plus Chael Sonnen and Wanderlei Silva. They delivered two out of those three, but it was a strong performing pay-per-view, strongest of the year, 500,000, I believe. And then 178 was supposed to feature John Jones and Daniel Cormier. That fell apart. They had a very stacked undercard. They had Conor McGregor, they had Donald Cerrone, Eddie Alvarez. They had a bunch of great fights, but the pay-per-view numbers might as well. I mean, they did have Mighty Mouse in the headliner, and that's what it sold like. Fans didn't care that it had a stacked undercard. They weren't buying the headliner. What's that say? Like, was it just a bad run of luck, or was this predictable? Was this preventable? I mean, Brian, what do you think of this? Could the UFC have done something different, or was this just the roll of the dice?
Well, like everyone's gonna say, too many shows, oversaturation. We're talking about injuries among champions. Who's been injured? John Jones, Cain Velasquez, Anthony Pettis.
But
And
those
even
last two guys were spending, the last several months on Ultimate Fighter, and Ultimate Fighter in Mexico, in Cain Velasquez's case, Ultimate Fighter on FS1 in Anthony Pettis' case. Is that a mistake?
well, if they can't fight, they might as well do some promotion and marketing for the UFC and attract fans somehow, right? Like the carnival's got to run into town, and the carnival barking has to start. What could the UFC done differently? It's not like the good old days of Pride when you had a bunch of guys. Not only that, but in the old days they had to pay guys less too. Guys got less of a pay-per-view cut, or they got less of a salary, so it was easier to have the stacked cards. What I've been advocating for, better financial parity for fighters, is actually working against the fans, because in boxing you only have one mega fight, and that one major fighter at the top of the card, Manny Pacquiao, can veto anyone being on this card if he wants them paid less, right? If he wants a bigger cut, and he does, and these guys do want money. They've got income tax problems, and they're fucked up, and they have other, legal bills. So who knows what is going on? So could the UFC have planned against this? I don't think so. Maybe fewer events, but who knows?
Yeah,
Jack, do you agree that the UFC played their hand as well as they could have?
yeah, I do. I think if you have so many slots to fill, you're not going to be able to put all of the awesome fights on one show. You're going to spread them out so that every show has a passable main event, something that feels like a main event. And in the past, they had less main events they had to cobble together, and so they could put two main events on a show or three. And keep in mind, those weren't necessarily brilliant strategic safeguards against potential injury. The injury bug has always been in MMA. There have been so many UFC cards, the Vitor Belfort the Vitor Belfort run has been, cross-generational in terms of last-minute fight pullouts. So it's always been an issue for the UFC, but because there are so many cards on the table at any given time, there's just so many fights going on that the injury bug just proportionally seems so much bigger, and it seems like some issue that in the past they were able to head off, but because they had less shows, we didn't have the volume of injuries we do now. Plus, fighters pulled out for less in the past. Fighters made the fights with some of the similar injuries that now I think they are much more prone to not risk it all on. I think a lot of this comes back to the fact that if you lose one fight in the UFC, you can get cut. That's not how it works in boxing. That's not how it works in just about any contract where, one thing goes wrong and you agree you're out of a job. I think if fighters lost only after it could get cut after only two consecutive losses, you'd see a bit more risk taking, and you'd see a bit less hesitancy to feel like, I'm not quite 100%, I'm not 90%, I'm not 80% like I like to be, so I'm not going to make the fight. I think that's wrapped up in here somewhere. It's part of the DNA of this issue, but with this volume of shows, it's not going to go away. There's too many fighters in the soup to not have these huge, haywire, waves going on. And I don't see. I mean, if there was a fix to it, I think we would have seen it by now. I think
both of you though are acting as if the biggest choice the UFC is making, which is to run so many of these cards and try to expand into so many markets at once, is something that they had no choice but to do. Did they really need to be messing around with trying to invade Asia, trying to put on shows in Europe when They've got plenty to struggle with here in North America. I mean, is it a life or death thing to escape the declining North American market? I mean, they just lost Sportsnet in Canada, or it appears they might. Showdown Joe lost his shoulder programming. The show about MMA on Sportsnet in Canada.
UFC Connected, and then it used to be called UFC Connected, and then it was something else.
Yeah, but now
UFC
it's
Central.
gone.
UFC Central.
Yeah, and so GSP carried that whole country. Canada used to be disproportionately the strongest market per capita for the UFC anywhere during the GSP era. GSP's basically gone. Now they're losing Canada. Meanwhile, they're off, trying to put on shows in Macau. They're talking about booking shows in South Korea. They're trying to put on a stadium show, in Melbourne, Australia. They're still talking shit about trying to do a stadium show in Brazil. You don't hear about that very often. They've got the Mexico expansion, which looks ambitious. I mean, is this a do or die thing? They have to do this international expansion, so they have to do this many shows, or should they be being less ambitious and scale back a little bit? Brian, what do you think?
I think they got a good deal in Japan with Dentsu, this advertising agency. So they pre-sold like all the tickets, or there was no risk to the UFC to outsource that. And then bigger companies, you have to make money, you have to scale things up constantly. Like that's how it's going to happen. Foreign broadcast rights are worth a shitload of money. They'll probably get Ireland with Conor. They've had trouble in Europe for a while with Britain with the TV deal between different stations, losing ESPN. And in Europe too, in Germany, at least one of the shows was co-promoted by a local promoter. So risk is being downloaded in these shows. I think it's a smart idea to get into Brazil or to try and get into Canada in some ways. But the UFC can't predict when they're going to find an ethnic star like Conor McGregor or Ronda, who's an American. They can't really predict this stuff. They have to kind of see like what the local land is. And they've had failures in Singapore and like with their office losing a lot of staff. So I mean, if things had worked out great and they'd found a Chinese superstar and they'd landed a TV deal, we would have been praising them. So they did take the risk and the investment. So pat them on the back for that.
Yeah, you have to always grow. For some reason, that's how American enterprise works. Unless you're growing, people don't take you seriously, or they don't take you as seriously as you would like them to take you. And so, thus, the pressure begins. You take out, a large credit facility, and every month you've got to pay that back in installments with interest. And God help you if a month comes and you can't make that deal, and you've got to restructure your debt and pay even more. And the UFC is leveraged that way. The UFC is highly. It's not a knock on it. It's very, very difficult and exceedingly rare to fund a company without some degree of debt. And everybody buys into this vision that if they finance your company, you're going to be able to grow their returns so that they make substantially more than they put on the table in the first place over time. Now, with those kind of pressures on the UFC at all times, plus the premium on diversification of revenue, it doesn't fly over the years as your company is growing to say, we make money one way. We sell fights on pay-per-view and that's it. They don't want to set themselves up like that as a one-off boxing-style promotional company. They want to set themselves up like World Wrestling Entertainment, where merchandise, international television revenue, domestic television revenue, web revenue through Fight Pass or your network or whatever digital subscription service, you want money coming in from as many different pots and as many different countries as you can, because investors like to see that, and everyone likes to see that, because if one area starts to suddenly get soft due to changes in market conditions, you can count on another which isn't as subject and as vulnerable to the same shifts in market conditions to still be strong. Mixed martial arts interest can be high in Brazil, and they can get the substantial money that they get from Globo and other platforms there to broadcast their shows, whereas back in America, for a million different reasons, injuries being the primary one, it's harder to draw on pay-per-view. I mean, everyone talks about how this sport can fit into the larger sports context. Will there come a point where it's pretty much set up the same way as Major League Baseball or the NFL? And the answer to that question is, once television networks are convinced that it's worth paying the UFC for their shows as much as they could make on pay-per-view, then they won't do pay-per-view. But until then, they've got their feet in so many different pots trying to stay diversified that every now and then it might look like, why are you doing all of this? But they're under substantial financial pressure to deliver. And, we just saw a new Standard & Poor's report that put its finger right on the fact that they recently canceled an event. That's losses. you can't take a loss in a month. You can't do it. And all of these shows, and Dana White is so keen to point this out, and perhaps rightfully so, when you look at the gates they do for the most part, plus factor in whatever television company is paying them to put the show on, these shows are making money. And if you're going to jump down the UFC's throat for going everywhere and making money because a pay-per-view that you've somehow had to buy, I guess, and then get mad about happens, I don't know what to tell you.
But don't you think, like, there's some analysis, there's reason to believe that if they did fewer pay-per-views, they make more money total off pay-per-views, because the marginal costs are all in flying the octagon out to wherever they take it to, the paying the fighters, and setting up the production. And if you have, 6 pay-per-views that each do 200,000, that doesn't add up, and you do 12,000, I don't know. I'm terrible with math.
I get your point. It's a nice thought, but it isn't as prudent financially as having 4 or 5 or 6 different sources of robust revenue than it is to say this one revenue stream will grow that much that it's worth not trying out all these other areas. They hit home runs. They find home runs out there. So it's absolutely worth trying. They can't run in place, and I know it aggravates the fans, and if they're really aggravated, they'll stop buying the shows. They have. The machine keeps rolling.
And so, as we roll into this fourth quarter, we've got the big shows coming up. I mean, we got UFC 179 with Aldo Mendez in Brazil. Probably not going to be a big show. But then you've got UFC 180. This is the big one. This is Velasquez versus Verdum, heavyweight title fight in Mexico City. They're doing great ratings in the Ultimate Fighter Latin America. They've been after the Mexican market, which is historically a huge fight market in North America, and they've been after it forever. They finally got a Mexican-American champ, a heavyweight champ. They've got him on the Ultimate Fighter. They've got him on a big success on Mexican television. Is 181 going to pan out? I mean, what do you think the odds are that Cain Velasquez is healthy for this fight? Brian, I mean, like, what happens if Cain gets hurt? You think this pay-per-view is going to happen as planned?
Even if he's hurt, he's still going to go forward, just like he went forward with the first Junior Dos Santos fight, right? I mean, Cain had a knee injury going into it, if I recall.
He was coming off shoulder surgery, and he had a knee injury, but he lost in 64 seconds, and that did incalculable damage to his brand in North America, because he was hyped as this, going to be the first ever Mexican heavyweight champion in any combat sport. Comes on, more people saw that fight than have seen all the rest of his fights put together, including when he destroyed Brock Lesnar. He got destroyed, and frankly, his brand has never recovered in the U.S. I mean, is it worth taking that risk for him? Are they going to sweeten the pot to get him to fight injured? Jack, what do you think?
Well, I think Cain Velasquez, by fighting injured for the very first Fox show against Junior Dos Santos, has proven that if the profile is high enough, he will go against his better interest, and he took a knockout for that, despite basically being a one-legged man and hobbling on an injury that, to my point earlier, most fighters would have easily pulled out of a fight over. And certainly there were rumblings that Cain was advised to do that, but the situation and the profile and the platform was just too high. Look, Cain Velasquez is an otherworldly mixed martial arts fighter, just an absolute force of nature, but he has injury issues. He just does. He's like Luke Rockhold in that sense. He has a difficult time building momentum because just at the point where he's strung together a win or two, something happens that shelves him and takes him out of the consciousness for a year. I mean, just a year, just shaved off in terms of us thinking about Cain Velasquez as a fighter, not just as some personality doing interviews. And as we know, he's not very strong in that department. So he's got to fight to bring out the most marketable parts of himself as a fighter. That's what it is. It's the fight. That's his product. And he isn't putting out a lot of it these days. And it's just because it's the way he trains. I mean, to my point earlier as well, I think Cain Velasquez has this gym rep for absolutely never stopping and absolutely pushing limits beyond just about anybody of any weight class at AKA, and it busts him up, and he can be resilient through a lot of these injuries. Javier Mendez talks about how amazing it is that Cain is sort of no-sold and shown no visible signs of, like, a shoulder tear he suffered in the 166 fight in Texas with Junior Dos Santos, for instance, and some other things that happened to him in the body of fights that you don't even know about until a day later, because he just doesn't show the pain. He doesn't express it in a way that he would send signals to anybody. And he's the last guy to try to create a sense that he's complaining about an injury. But he gets too many of them. And I I don't know what can fix it, because the training that leads to that injury rate is what makes him a special fighter in the heavyweight constellation. It really is.
So, what do you think? What do you have a pay-per-view projection for this one, Brian? What do you think?
I think maybe 400,000 to 500,000. But even no matter what I say, the only numbers we have, except for the ones that were estimated from Randy Couture's lawsuit, are just estimates, and so we don't really know. But I'll say 400,000.
And Jack, what do you think? What are you calling for?
I'd
What would be a
say-
success?
What would be a success?
Yeah.
Well, that's a much different question.
Well,
These days, success is 3 to 4,
And what do you
probably.
think it'll do?
I think it'll do between 250 and 3, based on UFC 166, the trilogy fight with Junior Dos Santos, not even hitting 300,000 pies, despite all the pieces being in place. Tough Latin America has only been on Fox Deportes. Mexico is obviously a market that's not really pay-per-view oriented when it comes to the UFC. It's much more consumed as a free product and
It's
a
going to be in
high-profile.
Televisa, Mexico.
Yeah, this is about Mexico, this card. You cannot look at the pay-per-view buys in the United States and make a judgment as to whether or not the UFC succeeded in what it sought to do. I don't think.
And so that puts even more pressure on UFC 181, which was supposed to feature Chris Weidman versus Vitor Belfort. But Chris Weidman, the middleweight champ, yet another one of these delicate flowers, pulled out with an injury. And now they've got Johnny Hendricks, who's rushing back, fighting much sooner than he had planned to after having his biceps sewn back on in a rematch against Robbie Lawler. And that'll be the last major pay-per-view of the year. Is that going to be enough? I mean, is there anything the UFC can do at this point to save 2014 from being their worst pay-per-view year since what? I mean, 2007?
But it's sad we're thinking about this as a business side. It used to be about great fights. It used to be about the match. When you think like Frazier Ali, or even GSP versus Matt Hughes, it used to be just about the fights and these guys and their legacies. And now, like, even the fans are looking at this and thinking, oh, well, how will the Fox deal, make this sport better or grow? All these stupid variables. The UFC undercut itself in so many ways by attacking these smaller promotions and consuming some larger ones and making the environment harder with sponsorship, because that's where you're going to get great fighters from. If they eased up on the contract situation, you would find the next GSP or the next Anderson, because in Brazil are these local guys, corrupt as they are, they're the ones who would invest and bring guys along to the point where they could be sold up to the next bidder, to the UFC or the bigger promotional stage. And that's how we got Fedor, Anderson, Shogun, GSP, these guys. But that's not happening.
So you think the pipeline's been choked off? Jack, do you agree? I mean, you've got Johnny Hendricks, a product of Team Takedown. They've invested a lot of money in that guy, and it's paid off with the UFC champion, but he's not quite a star.
Yeah. Well, I think he's definitely growing as a public profile, and I think the GSP fight did wonders for him in terms of people accepting him as someone worth going out of your way to see. But I think, to Brian's point, it's dead on. The UFC is out of little star-making factories that they can buy and infuse their roster overnight with 10 guys that you can't wait to see fight the UFC guys. We still, to this day, talk about how the WEC is representing in the UFC. Okay, that's still a narrative that MMA fans not only like, they need. And the UFC's not buying Bellator; they're owned by Viacom. There's not really another roster that they can gobble up to instantly create fresh matchups overnight, and that's been part of their life cycle for several years. I mean, I'm talking back to not only the Strikeforce purchase, but also bringing in all the Affliction. Yeah, the Affliction guys, the WEC wave, all
Pride.
Yes, and the women, I think, was the latest.
Jackson Lyoto Machida came from a one and done promotion, but they bought the whole promotion just to get those 2 contracts.
Bought the World Fighting Alliance, and thus were flush with stars. Pride, of course. I mean, come on, it started with Pride, and the life cycle of the UFC in terms of creating fresh matchups that people want to see has come from buying these rosters, really, or at least putting the competitor out of business such that these fighters became available to them. At the same time, they were making enough money to suddenly afford them. That's over. I mean, the stars are going to have to start, as these 4-0 guys on a prelim, on a Fight Pass show, and we wonder why they're UFC fighters, and just grow right under the umbrella of the organization. And to Brian's point, that is so hard, because the UFC cannot devote the same resources that these other promotions, struggling to find a star would, in terms of getting behind a guy.
And they also have so many platforms. I mean, if you look at the career arcs of these guys, and some of these guys like Alexander Gustafsson, this is a guy who goes, fought a couple times on Spike, then it was on a pay-per-view, then he fought he fought on FX, then he fought on Fight Pass, fought on Fox Sports 2, then he's headlining a pay-per-view. Like, there's not, for casual fans, it's like, who the fuck are these people? They've never seen him before. They have great performances that could have been career-making performances, but they're shunted off, onto UFC Japan on Fight Pass, or they're on Fox Sports 2, and just nobody sees them, and nobody knows where to catch up. There's just no narrative, and like, is there anything the UFC can do? I mean, the WEC was under the Zuffa banner, and that was a great little engine that could. Fans were fond of it. It ran on Sunday nights. There was no pressure. People were happy with the product. There was no complaining about it. It had the small cage, so it delivered a lot of action, and yet Versus, or the predecessor NBC, didn't want to carry a UFC off-brand. They wanted to see, I want to carry the premier brand or nothing. And so now you've got UFC itself watered down. Like, can they do anything to do regional leagues, or what can they do to recreate stars? Is there any kind of organic star-making process they can do, Brian?
Oh, my thinking is that they've tried to maximize profit for such a long time and tried to pick the crop a little bit too early, so they've stunted their own growth. If they backed off, there would be other players who would enter the equation. We had Pride for many years. We had a strong Japanese MMA scene until the Yakuza scandal. If they back down, Glory could, and there's other organizations there that could foreseeably help nurture some new talent. But their mentality isn't to actually actively, do something that would change things. We could get things kicked, like MMA could turn into kickboxing where it's total shit, where there's a bunch of belts and there's no recognition of it as a sport. I don't know if the UFC itself has the mentality to steer the ship in a different direction. But what's interesting is, one thing that did help make the sport successful in Canada is money from organized crime, from the biker gangs. They needed a way to launder their money in Montreal, so they would invest in these small promotions. We don't have that anymore. There was a bunch of crackdown on that. That's where GSP came from shows called TKO. And as dirty as it is, those are some of the answers to solve the problems in fighting. Also, with The Ultimate Fighter, it's not like a documentary style, oh, this is the fighter, this is her home, let's meet her family. They have The Ultimate Fighter, which is just a piece of shit reality show. And it's slumming, it's showing these girls undressing, it's not telling the real stories of heartbreak, of how they got that far in the way they deserve to be told. Like Ben Folks had a great story on India Gomez, coming from the streets, being a cocaine addict, and then, fighting a man in Real Heroes. That's the true story of a female fighter, these are dark stories. We're not really getting them.
So, Jack, do you agree with that? Do they need to retool The Ultimate Fighter? Are they going to retool The Ultimate Fighter? Or are they just going to run it into the ground as is until it no longer, literally cannot be carried on cable anymore?
The latter. They will not change anything substantive about the show, because it still is their premier platform to get people to care about fighters, be it the coaches in their pay-per-view fight, or be it the athletes that come out of the show with a name recognition boost that still can't be matched. I don't care what you say. I think this idea that, because we as writers love the backstory of these fighters and want to learn about their backstory means money is just, I think that's specious. I think you want to be careful about that. What's money is grudge matches. What's money are two fighters with personalities telling you what they're going to do and then doing it, or telling you what they're going to do and then making you at least want to see whether or not they can do it. Fighters need to be less deferential towards each other. They need to put themselves more in silos that say this is my industry. I am my own industry. All these teammates, these places I can't go in terms of expressing strong, pointed things in interviews and in front of countdown cameras because I don't want to hurt feelings. These things, they have to end. They have to melt away, because if you don't have grudges, you don't have anything in combat sports.
And how do you rate the current coaches of the Ultimate Fighter, Anthony Pettis and Gilbert Melendez? They're building up a lightweight title fight for UFC 181.
Mm-hmm.
Are you feeling any heat from that?
No.
I'm feeling nothing.
No, and that's why the Ultimate Fighter so often falls flat, and why when Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate come along and can't get away from each other's throats, everybody's like, oh, I guess Tough is pretty cool. Yeah, because it's all about whether the coaches are forceful personalities, and if you can get a few fighters in the house too that are forceful personalities, suddenly Tough is still, there's still something to be said for Tough. Yeah, of course, it's based on the personalities. It always is. It's a personality-driven industry, and it will continue to be that way as long as it's all about selling pay-per-views
But
and
Anthony
selling stars
Pettis,
and
this is
grudges.
a guy, the Showtime kick.
Yeah,
He
he
was
didn't.
on an MTV special, and he really clicked with demos that are outside the UFC's norm. Young girls really like the guy.
I need to see the buy rate. I need to see the buy rate that proves that amounts to the real cheddar in this industry.
And what kind of buy rate are you looking at for 181?
Something above average. Something above 300,000. Something that shows that when Anthony Pettis fights, people think that's the show of the 4 a year that's worth buying, that they care to buy as people who don't consume every single moment of MMA. And that's what the Ultimate Fighter can do. Cameras are on. You've got a guy right there, 13 straight weeks. You can go after him and make people want to see you either get your ass kicked or kick some ass. I mean, it's very simple, but there are so many factors that soften fighters' willingness to go there, and maybe they don't have it in them, and that's fine. But their career ceiling is going to be low because of that, or at least limited because of that. And what can you do? If you get that kind of heat going, if you get a Conor McGregor, if you get a wordsmith in the front door who can back it up in the ring, you got to get this stuff on Fox, big Fox. You have to push Fox to actually get it in front of a channel that people watch. I mean, that's a lot of the dilution and the ratings evidence we think we have that people don't care about Tough anymore has a lot to do about the relative strength or weakness of FS1 compared to Spike.
Absolutely. And Brian, what do you think? What are you expecting for the UFC 181 pay-per-view numbers? You got Hendricks, Lawler, and Pettis Melendez, two big title fights. Ben's been waiting for a long time to see these guys fight. Is it going to blow up?
It all depends. Like, I'm not feeling too much heat. I mean, I would say the first one did 171 did 300,000 buys, so
Yeah.
I would go with somewhere similar. What really everyone wants is GSP to come back, and just like they kept asking Muhammad Ali to come back, and now you see why it's even worse than it was back in the day, because now you got all these things like the credit rating, broadcast rights, Sportsnet, and then that could help. So how could Lawler become a bigger star? How could Hendricks become a bigger star? Lawler's been around for a while. Is there any more dimension to Johnny Hendricks' personality that's yet to be explored? Is there a way to get him onto
I mean, he was
the late night
hated in
talk
college
shows?
wrestling. I mean, this guy, gyms all over Iowa would explode at the mention of this guy's name. I mean,
You know how you get something new out of Johnny? You bring in Ben Askren and have them sit down with John Anik for an hour and see what happens.
And that to me was a historic blown opportunity. I don't care how boring Ben Askren's fighting style is, and I don't care. I mean, the fact that he's a pain in the ass, that's a net win. I mean, you'd think that these are guys who made a fortune off of Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock. You'd think they would recall that, hey, sometimes dealing with assholes is just part of the business, because Ben Askren and Johnny Hendricks is a natural rivalry. Ben Askren is a guy that fans will love to hate, and the boring fighting style just adds to that.
Yeah,
And I still can't fathom their thinking with that. Was that a control issue, or did they really buy into the hype that this guy's a boring fighter, nobody's going to want to watch him?
Ben Askren's a big head scratcher. He really is. In terms of why the UFC didn't bite, I asked Dana White at the Fight Night event at the TD Garden in Boston that Chael and Shogun fought in the pre-fight scrum, "Are you interested in Ben Askren?" He said, "Yeah, we'll talk to Ben Askren." A month later, absolutely not, and he's going to ONE FC. It's not like the UFC had this objective reason to not sign Ben Askren. This reason that could not change. It changed. I don't know what it is.
Team, they had a meeting that Askren came out thinking he was going to get a deal, and then nothing.
Yeah.
Was this like the Gina Carano situation? I mean, they spent weeks trying to negotiate with Gina Carano. She's got a career in Hollywood, and she knows that losing to Ronda Rousey, she's going to be competing with Ronda Rousey for movie parts, and so it's got to be enough money to make it worth that risk. And they come away saying, "Oh, we can't deal with Gina Carano. She's got the worst managers ever." I mean, Brian, is that where they're at? Like, they just can't deal with people that potentially could be making their business? I mean, can they fix this, or is this just going to be a reality?
Ironically, the decision not to sign Ben Askren had to do with what we're talking about, these pay-per-view numbers. And they had this belief that they could appoint their own star, Johnny Hendricks, and appoint their own champion, and which is what you do when you're corrupt and you don't want someone to fight for the belt. And now we're seeing how it's backfired. You know, Fedor was supposed to be boring. Pride didn't want him as their champion. But in the end, like his constant winning and constant fighting, he went on a roll and he built himself up to a massive star, even though he didn't seem like he was going to be anything. And so this micromanagement, the one hallmark of the UFC is consistent micromanagement of journalists, of fighters, of the interviews fighters can give, of trying to manage controversy. Even controversy can help a promoter. Look at what Don King did with it. Look at Bob Arum. You know, look at Mike Tyson. If these personalities explode and do crazy shit, there's positives there. You know, MMA's in the news thanks to Mayhem. You know, there's a way a guy like Don King would have milked this or found something positive. But because of Dana being a little bit emotional, he's going to blame his personal unhappiness on his employees, which is what, you know, bad managers do. He doesn't see the opportunity.
That is bold words, Brian. You've called for more organized crime in MMA, and now you're saying, "Oh, that's not a nice guy. I don't know what we're gonna do with."
Yeah, we're heading to a dystopia really quickly here.
That's big. Dystopia is huge. People love sci-fi movies. Is this?
Yeah, there you go, and maybe that's where Tough will head. I don't know, sci-fi. I think, of course, you know, Jones Cormier do something that's bad for the sport. Oh my God! And that pay-per-view would have done 1 million buys. Okay,
And
if they hadn't shoved each other,
on January 3rd,
could do 1 million, especially if they supplant it with Ronda. I mean, you know, Ronda, a supporting cast to the Weidman Silva rematch, also did 1 million. It can happen. It's not like that's long gone. It just takes a lot more to approach it than I think it used to. And you know, and yeah, of course, when fighters are at each other's throats, to my point earlier, but you need fighters with charisma, and there's not enough of them. There's not many of them. So when Ben Askren is out there, and he can electrify in his interviews, and he can command attention in what he says, the rest doesn't matter. The problem with John Fitch, for instance, as fantastic a fighter as he is, as first ballot a Hall of Famer as he is, as tremendous a welterweight as he was, is that his fight style was matched with a drawl kind of uninteresting interview style. And it's just, that's, you know, you can't blame fighters for that. And if you don't have charisma, you have a place in this sport. But the fighters who do have charisma, to shut them out for, it's backwards. It's ass backwards. It's like, okay, he happens to be a boring fighter in terms of his proclivity to take people down. But it's very easy to explain to your audience why that's fascinating. And then it's interesting to see Ben Askren do this. You know, just sort of what appears to be, but clearly isn't, lazily just drop for a single right in front of the guy. Like, go ahead, knee me. And he gets you every single time because he knows where your feet are going to be to drop for that single, because he's a freaking incredible wrestler and he's a great reader of body language. And I remember talking to him about that. It's like, I managed to make it look like I'm just performing without any real motivation and just kicking ass, but you know, it has a lot to do with the cerebral nature of my game and my physical instincts. There you go. Now all of a sudden Ben Askren's interesting, and what everyone says is boring about it, Ben Askren isn't. And you don't have to, you know, oversell that because he has a dearth of personality. He's got all the personality in the world. He's money waiting to be made. And if his fight style is truly the reason that they don't want to bring him in, they're not paying enough attention, or Dana isn't plugged into the fact that Ben Askren is a money promo, and those are the rare breed. Those are the guys you need to hoard and collect and have under your banner.
Yeah, and it seems like with guys like Chael Sonnen that are willing to play the game and do anything to please Dana White, they're willing to put up with a lot of bullshit, felony convictions, drug test failures. But with somebody that rocks the boat and pushes back a little bit, like Ben Askren, it's like we can't have that. And yet, you know, these are guys that made their fortune with, I mean, they had their Chuck Liddells and their Matt Hugheses, but they also had their Titos and their Ken Shamrocks, who, you know, were always a headache to deal with.
Yeah.
And so it just, especially the fact that now their credit ratings getting dinged, their pay-per-view numbers are in the can. You know, there's all kinds of rumblings out there about TV deals, you know, about sales of the company long-term, things they want to do that may not happen now. What's it take for these guys to evaluate their business model and make some changes? I mean, like I feel like they signed Holly Holm, and they've indicated a willingness to sign Chris Cyborg or let her come back. They've created a path for Chris Cyborg to come back. If she cuts down to 135, wins a fight there, drug test clean, they almost signed Gina Carano. They're clearly willing to take some pains and do things they don't want to do to feed Ronda Rousey credible opponents, big name opponents. But is that the only change we're going to see? What do they need to do? What are they likely to do? That's the question. What are they likely to do in the next 6 months that'll be a change that'll be better for their business? Brian, what do you think the one thing they could do, and what do you think the one thing they will do is?
Oh, really tough question. It's a really tough question. Because the things that I think they should do are always going to be behind the scene things with management, allowing managers, allowing sponsors to sponsor different fighters, not trying to control people so much to micromanage them, not beating down journalists anytime journalists try and say or do something even remotely truthful, especially your own guys.
Despicable.
Yeah.
Like saying that the
Yeah,
pay-per-view isn't like saying you're not going to buy a pay-per-view. That is just the definition of disgusting and despicable. So
look at how loyal Dave Meltzer's been all these years, and he releases some realistic numbers about ticket sales, and he's the enemy. Why? Like he's your best
friend. It's a different situation because he knows kayfabe and he knows it's his place to when somebody needs to be dragged out and whipped, drag out Dave Meltzer, and he doesn't give a shit. Like his business is secure. He doesn't care, really what Dana's saying about him. I mean, but I don't think being nice to journalists, that's not going to get him that extra 100,000 pay-per-view buys or improve their ratings that they need. I mean, give me something big. One juicy idea that the UFC's likely to implement.
The only thing they could do is bring somebody back, get someone old school back, someone who's a proven draw. Because 6 months isn't going to build anybody up. Will Conor win enough fights to make it out into the big leagues? We'll see. Jack?
Yeah, I said it earlier. Get on Fox, bring back primetime, and put it on Fox in primetime. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 7:30, 8, not Sunday afternoon on different channels, depending on your market and affiliate. Take the fact that Fox is a preeminent American network that has some of the most en masse audience of any channel in any country, on any country in the globe, and actually put your hype in front of those people, not just your live fights, which have often limited upside in terms of star-making potential. Look, if you end up putting Matt Brown versus Eric Silva on Fox in prime time, Matt Brown becomes a star. That's true. But those fights are so hard to predict. What's easier to control is slick production value and what used to be the UFC's signature touch of recognizing in fighters what could be money and enhancing it and bring it forward. I feel like they're so busy now that they don't have the time to really sit down and think about who they've got on their roster and who could be money. They just hope that organically fighters, top 10 guys fighting each other figures it out. And we all know, just based on Conor McGregor alone, that it's not about that. It's not about, the guys who are best in their division are going to be the biggest stars. No, you have to match make towards the guys who could be money. You have to protect them. As antithetical as that sounds to a lot of people, it's the only way this thing works. It's the only way it has worked. It's the only way it probably ever will work.
Yeah, I mean,
that's... You have a guy with star qualities, you match make him carefully so that when he finally has that fight that he could very well lose, when he has that test, you've made some money off of him, and he's got enough steam that he can recover from it, and it's not just, all right, that guy's done next. And that's what they're doing with Conor. So I think if there's one juicy idea that they can do, it's press to whatever degree they can to bring back primetime and to put it on Fox at a time when a lot of people will see it. Because it's all about eyeballs. It's all about the loss of eyeballs from Spike to FS1 and how all of a sudden it seems so much harder to get people to care. It's just harder to get your hype in front of people. People talk about Twitter and social media and how that can... No. First of all, people who are dialed into that already care about MMA to a degree. They know who these fighters are. They're following these accounts. Second of all, on this past Saturday night when they had the Major League Baseball playoff game run especially long, you could not... it was impossible to not know that these fights were on FX, that they put the main card to FX due to the long run of the baseball game. And they did 330,000 average for the FX version, and they did 900,000+ for the average of just the two UFC fights that made air on Fox Sports 1. social media does not tell people where and why to care about fights. Hype shows like Primetime do, you just got to put them on a station. You have to have the right touch. You have to do them artfully. You have to do them well, but you've got to put them on a station that people can see. So that's my juicy idea.
I see. I kind of like that one, and I've got a variation. This is not going to happen. This is never something they would do. But if I was them, I would cut a peace deal with Spike. They made a lot of money with Spike back in the day. Like I would say, look, you got Bellator. We get it. Fine. Number 2 promotion. You can take our cast-offs. You can take our guys that we're done with, like Rampage and Tito. Pay them too much. Fine, whatever. But what we want to do is pay you to bring back MMA Uncensored. Just like we paid you to put on Tough. This was a show that was bringing in reliably 500,000 viewers a week.
For one reason, Nate, I got to cut you off. For one reason, because it came on after pro wrestling.
They've still got TNA may or may not be there, but they've still got the programming. It might be too late, but MMA fans know they can get their MMA on Spike, and I still think there's a big audience for it there. They fucked up. I mean, Spike killed that show because Dana White started trashing them in the press, and they didn't like it because it broke their control. The whole idea of a show called MMA Uncensored just gave them the heebie-jeebies, and it also gave Bellator an opportunity. It was also stupid of Spike to cut it off because they could have had an opportunity to put their Bellator stars on a show as peers of UFC stars. But I think it was just a huge missed opportunity there from both parts. And it's just the whole tale of Bellator, like the way that the Eddie Alvarez suit, if you listen to Sam Kaplan talk, the Eddie Alvarez fiasco, which cost MMA a big fight, it cost Eddie Alvarez the heart of his career, was a 3-way fuck-up. The UFC underbidding, Bellator being assholes about it, and Alvarez's management being stupid. And that's the kind of, everybody pitches in to do the wrong thing in MMA. That's how we live in this dystopia where we don't have enough organized crime. Right, Brian?
To thread it back. You're kind of mad, Nate. You got to calm down, man.
I know.
Do
They're killing my sport. They're killing my sport.
Do you enjoy MMA or not? I'm starting to wonder.
I do. I still do. When there's, this last Saturday though sucked ass. I mean, the Halifax card was dismal, but the Japan card 2 weeks before that was great. I mean, if you can put a good fight in front of me, I still love the shit out of it. But hours and hours and hours of bad fights, it sucks the life out of you.
Yeah.
How about you?
It sucks the life out of you.
MMA?
What's that?
Do you still enjoy MMA?
Oh yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, I consume it in proportion to my passion for it. It's like if I feel like a fight card doesn't have a whole hell of a lot of fights I care about, I of course watch them, but I watch them in abbreviated fashion, or I try to do the reverse where I read about the fights to figure out the highlights, and then this is all immaterial. The point is, when it comes to the UFC, it's like if they put on some fights people want to see, that's enough. This unique problem to MMA fans that because every fight I have to watch 24 fights on a doubleheader week. Well, no, you don't. It's like, and if you feel like you do, it's not the UFC's fault that you feel like you do. It's just it's your habit, your obsession, your compulsion that you have to watch every fight. So you get mad at the UFC when they're boring. It's like they're not doing these fights so that people who would watch every single fight they do will watch anyway. They're doing it to put the UFC product in front of crowds that, ostensibly will pay tickets to go into the arena and watch live fights because there's money to be made at the gate. And I know fans aren't really going to care about those business prerogatives, but that's why it's the way it is. And if you really, don't like these cards, you just shouldn't watch them. And if you feel like you can't not watch them, then I'm sorry, like you're gonna get ulcers, and I feel bad for you, and I don't get it, because if there are fighters you do like, watch their fights, and then go the rest of the time go get something to eat.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Brian, do you have any final thoughts? Is that the cure? Watch less fights, quit complaining.
The amazing thing is that the UFC downloaded their marketing duties on a journalist. So when their business suffers, we actually have to pitch in or come up with ideas or think, well, how can we fix this? How can we make the fans interested? It's almost like our dependence on their business, to have jobs has made this a central issue. And what Jack's saying can't be done for certain people. There's certain guys who have to keep shilling for whatever awful card there is, or awful or whatever mediocre product there is on Fight Pass. And that's the bizarre thing. And boxing, of course, maybe it's similar in some ways, but the storylines are easier to follow and to pick or choose. If you like the Klitschko brothers, if you like Joe Calzaghe, or the Super Six tournament on Showtime, there's easier pick and choose entrees, or Manny Pacquiao or Floyd. We don't penalize people for saying, all right, I'm only going to watch Floyd Mayweather's fight. Of course, that's what the mainstream knows. We know he's the only mainstream fighter, him or Manny Pacquiao, and that's just the way it is. And no one in boxing really complains. They know there's only room for a couple major stars. I don't think boxing has the same problems. I don't like the WWE model for MMA. I think like the Pride model, where you had like this incredible video footage and this wonderful lead up to Crow Cop versus Fedor with like the Terminator soundtrack, and all these little bells and whistles. I think that's the way it should be. And I want to see that kind of slick production like Jack is talking about. And I want a more event-based thing where it's like you see a couple fights, and those are the fights. And you know what? For the other guys, it's tough, but rise to the top, or you'll be a domestic star, or you'll have the prestige of earning a belt. That's just the way it's got to be. This is like gladiators. It's tough, and only a few will make it.
I see. Harsh words from some harsh voices. Thanks for being on the show, guys. Hope everybody enjoyed it. And where can we follow you on Twitter, Brian, and read your stuff?
You can go to @Thracian_books.
And where are you writing these days? Still a Cage Potato?
Yeah, right for a Cage Potato. I haven't written for a while, but stuff like that.
Get back on that horse. And Jack, are you doing any shows? What do you got to plug?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter @SherdogRewind, even if it's not related to the podcast. That's pretty much my MMA Twitter handle. So always working on audio and stuff. Love doing MMA audio, so get at me. And like I said, it's been a while since I've been on the air with a Rewind, but we're going to get it back together. We're going to get the ship righted, and we're going to be coming at you quite soon.
I'll hold you to that. The band is going to get back together and do some shows. And you can follow me at KidNate. Read me on BloodyElbow.com. You can see more magic like this if you subscribe to MMANation.com on YouTube. That's MMANation.com on YouTube. Read me on Bloody Elbow. And adios, MMA aficionados. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.